Imagine attending a funeral in Ohio. The mourners weeping, the coffin lowered, the prayers being said. And then, just as the dirt is about to cover the grave, a stranger shouts, "She's alive!" What would you do? Tonight, I want to tell you a true-to-life story of betrayal, survival, and an unexpected love that grew from the darkest place. This isn't just about death cheated. It's about second chances, forgiveness, and how the most unlikely people can change our lives forever. But what happened that day in the Ohio graveyard was only the beginning. Because the real story, the betrayals, the trial, and the unexpected bond that would change everything, was still waiting to unfold. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. It was a gray morning in Ohio, the kind of morning when the sky feels too heavy, pressing down on every heart. The small-town cemetery was filled with people dressed in black, their voices hushed, their steps heavy as they gathered around the casket that lay at the center. It wasn't just any funeral. This was the funeral of Judith Miller, a woman who had built one of the largest businesses in the state, a woman admired and respected by thousands. She was a symbol of strength, of success, of resilience, and yet here she was, lowered into the earth too soon, leaving behind whispers of shock and sorrow. The crowd that gathered that day was not only made up of family and close friends but also employees, local leaders, and people who had been touched by Judith's kindness at some point in their lives. Some came out of love, some came out of duty, and some came simply to see for themselves that this larger-than-life woman was truly gone. At the front stood her husband, Richard Miller, his face carefully arranged into the expression of a grieving widower. He dabbed his eyes occasionally with a handkerchief, though those closest to him couldn't help but notice how dry his eyes really were. Standing next to him was Dr. Stephen Harris, the family's physician, who had declared Judith dead just 3 days earlier. He looked down at the casket, his face pale and expression stiff, as if he too was carrying something heavier than grief. The pastor began his words of comfort, his voice rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of scripture and consolation, when suddenly the silence of mourning was broken. A rough, hoarse voice called out from the back. People turned, startled, as a man in worn-out clothes pushed his way through the crowd. His beard was unkempt, his jacket torn, and his shoes barely held together, but his eyes burned with urgency. His name was Benjamin Carter. To most people in town, he was just another homeless man who roamed the streets, muttering to himself and asking for spare change. But in that moment, he didn't look like a man asking for pity. He looked like a man on a mission. "Stop!" Benjamin shouted, raising his hand toward the casket. His voice was raw, almost desperate. "Don't bury her. She's not dead. Judith is still alive." Gasps rose from the crowd. The pastor stopped mid-sentence, his Bible trembling slightly in his hand. Richard's face twisted into a mask of outrage. "What kind of madness is this?" he demanded, stepping forward. "Get this man out of here. This is a funeral, not a circus." But Benjamin stood his ground, his chest heaving. "I know what I'm saying sounds crazy," he cried, looking at the shocked faces staring back at him. "But listen to me, she isn't gone. She's been given something, a drug that makes her look dead. I've seen this before. I know what I'm talking about. If you put her in that ground today, you'll be burying her alive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh at the absurdity or to shudder at the possibility. Some looked toward Dr. Harris, expecting him to dismiss the claim, and he did not hesitate. "This is nonsense," he said firmly, his professional tone carrying authority. "Mrs. Miller was examined thoroughly. She is deceased. I signed the death certificate myself. This man is clearly disturbed." Richard nodded vigorously, seizing the moment to regain control. "You see, he's delusional. He's nothing but a vagrant who feeds on people's kindness. To interrupt my wife's funeral with such madness, it's an insult." Benjamin's face flushed with anger, but there was pain in his eyes too. "You don't understand," he insisted, his voice breaking. "I know what I saw. Can prove it." Just give me one chance to check. If I'm wrong, I'll leave this place forever and you'll never hear from me again. But if I'm right. His words trailed off, heavy with the weight of the unspoken. The air was thick with tension. Some of Judith's employees, who had admired her strength and believed in her almost like family, found themselves leaning toward Benjamin's side. They knew she was a fighter, a survivor. Could it really be possible that she was fighting even now? Others shook their heads, embarrassed by the interruption, eager to dismiss the man and move on with the ritual. The pastor, caught between order and conscience, hesitated. Perhaps, he began carefully, but Richard cut him off sharply. Absolutely not. I will not have this funeral turned into a spectacle by a lunatic. He turned to the two men standing at the edge of the crowd, the security officers he had hired. Remove him. As the officers began to approach, Benjamin fell to his knees, his voice rising in desperation. Please, don't do this. I know you all think I'm crazy, but I swear on my life, Judith Miller is alive right now. She's breathing, her heart is beating, but too faint for the eye to see. If you bury her today, her blood will be on all of you. Something in his voice cracked through the wall of skepticism. The crowd froze. Mothers held their children closer. Older men removed their hats in hesitation, and young workers who had admired Judith looked at one another with doubt in their eyes. It was Margaret, Judith's younger sister, who finally stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes wet with tears, but she turned to Richard with a firmness in her voice. Richard, she said quietly, what if he's right? What harm would it do to check? Richard's face hardened. You can't be serious. This man is a drunk, a nobody. You'd take his word over mine. Over Dr. Harris. His voice rose with indignation, but beneath it there was a flicker of fear, a crack in his carefully maintained composure. Margaret didn't back down. This is my sister we're talking about. If there's even the smallest chance she's alive, I want it checked. You can call it foolish, you can call it desperate, but I'd rather be foolish than bury her alive. The crowd murmured again, louder this time, the tide slowly turning. People looked at Richard expectantly, and though his face burned with anger, he could see that resistance would only make him look cruel. He clenched his jaw and stepped back with a sharp wave of his hand. Fine, he spat. Let him embarrass himself. Benjamin rose shakily to his feet, his hands trembling as he stepped toward the casket. The lid creaked as it opened, and the sight of Judith's still face drew a collective gasp. Her skin was pale, her lips faintly blue, and her body lay utterly motionless. She looked every bit the image of death. For a moment, doubt clouded even Benjamin's eyes. What if he was wrong? What if his mind, worn down by years of hardship, had tricked him? But no. He pressed his fingers gently against her neck, closing his eyes to focus. His own heart pounded in his chest as he searched for what only he believed to be there. And then he felt it. So faint, so fragile, but undeniably real. The slow, steady beat of life. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. She's alive, he whispered, tears filling his eyes. Oh God, she's alive. The crowd erupted. Cries of disbelief and shock filled the air. Some screamed, others wept, and a few fell to their knees in prayer. Richard's face drained of color. His lips parted in stunned silence, while Dr. Harris stumbled back a step, his mask of authority slipping away. Benjamin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, his last treasure from a past life most people had long forgotten. He poured a few drops onto Judith's lips, whispering softly, urging her to return. For a moment nothing happened. The air grew heavier, the silence unbearable. Then a faint twitch of her fingers, a flutter of her eyelids, and finally a ragged, gasping breath that seemed to shake the earth itself. Judith Miller was alive. The crowd screamed in astonishment, some rushing forward, others falling back in fear as if witnessing a miracle. Margaret cried out her sister's name, clutching at the edge of the casket as Judith's eyes flickered open, dazed and filled with confusion. Richard stood frozen, his face twisted in horror, while Dr. Harris turned away, his hands trembling violently. Benjamin, tears streaming down his face, whispered to the stunned crowd, I told you she was still here." And in that moment, the funeral of Judith Miller became the day she rose from the grave, and the secrets that had been buried with her began to claw their way into the light. The cemetery was no longer a place of mourning, it had become a battlefield of emotions. People shouted, some screamed, others clung to one another in disbelief as Judith Miller, thought to be dead, breathed again before their very eyes. It was as though the ground itself had split open, exposing the fragile line between life and death. The stillness of the funeral had turned into a storm. Margaret fell to her knees beside the casket, clutching her sister's cold hand as though afraid she might lose her again. Judith, it's me. It's Margaret. You're safe. You're safe now." Her voice trembled, half choked by tears, but her grip was firm, pulling her sister back toward life. Judith's lips parted, but only a faint sound came out, a weak attempt at words swallowed by the gasps of air she struggled to take in. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, fragile but determined. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see. Some whispered miracle under their breath, others crossed themselves, and still others simply stared, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. People who had worked for Judith for years wept openly, clinging to one another. She had been their leader, their protector, and now it seemed as if she had clawed her way back from the grave itself. But not everyone in that moment was filled with awe or gratitude. Richard Miller's face had hardened into something dark and dangerous. His handkerchief, once used to dab away fake tears, was now crumpled in his clenched fist. His eyes darted from his wife's twitching hand to Benjamin, who stood nearby, exhausted but resolute, as if the weight of the whole world had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Richard opened his mouth, ready to shout, to regain control of the chaos, but his voice failed him. Instead, it was Dr. Harris who spoke, his tone sharp and defensive. This doesn't change anything," the doctor stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's a reflex. Happens sometimes. Muscles twitch, nerves fire. It doesn't mean she's alive." His words were hollow, falling flat in the face of Judith's very real, very visible breaths. People looked at him with suspicion now, their faith in his authority cracking like thin glass. "No," Benjamin said, his voice hoarse but steady. He pointed at Judith, who struggled to lift her hand toward her sister's cheek. "That's not a reflex. That's life. You all saw it. You all heard it. It is here. She's alive." The truth of it could not be denied. Judith's eyes, though heavy, opened wider. She looked around, confusion clouding her gaze, but recognition flickered when she saw her sister's face. A soft sound escaped her lips, almost like a whisper, almost like a plea. Margaret leaned closer, her tears falling onto Judith's skin. "I'm here, Judith. You're safe now. I promise you you're safe." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, a wave of astonishment and outrage breaking over the cemetery. Questions flew from every corner. How was this possible? How could the doctor have declared her dead if she was still breathing? What had been done to her? And who was responsible for nearly burying her alive? The weight of those questions pressed heavily on Richard and Dr. Harris. The two men exchanged a glance, one filled with unspoken panic. Richard's jaw tightened as he finally found his voice. "This is madness," he spat, his face flushed with fury. "Some kind of trick. He pointed a shaking finger at Benjamin. "He's playing you all. He's trying to humiliate this family, trying to make a mockery of my wife's death. And now you fools are letting him." But his words no longer carried the power they once had. Doubt had already taken root in the crowd, and no amount of bluster could pull it out. People began murmuring louder, their whispers filled with suspicion and anger. Some turned on Richard, others on the doctor, but none of them looked at Benjamin with scorn anymore. For the first time in years, The man they had dismissed as nothing more than a ragged homeless wanderer stood tall in their eyes. He had spoken the truth when no one else dared. Margaret rose from the casket, her hand still clasped tightly around Judith's. She turned to face Richard, her voice shaking with both fear and fury. "How could you?" she demanded, her words sharp as knives. "How could you let this happen? How could you almost bury her alive?" Richard's face twisted, but he said nothing. Dr. Harris stepped forward instead, his hands raised in a weak attempt at control. "Let's not rush to conclusions. We don't know what happened here. We need to get her to a hospital immediately. That's what matters now." "Yes," Margaret snapped, "but we also need answers. And we will get them." With the help of several mourners, Judith was carefully lifted from the casket, her frail body wrapped in blankets. She was carried toward a waiting car as the crowd parted, watching in silence as their once dead leader was taken to safety. Benjamin walked alongside, his steps unsteady but his heart pounding with a sense of victory he had never known. For years he had been invisible, dismissed, ignored. But today he had saved a life, Judith's life, and nothing would ever erase that truth. But even as Judith was taken from the cemetery, the tension did not ease. Richard stood rigid, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. He had planned everything so carefully, every detail of Judith's supposed death and burial. It had all been perfect, until Benjamin had appeared out of nowhere and shattered his scheme. His eyes followed the homeless man with burning hatred. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, word of the miracle spread like wildfire. By morning, the entire state of Ohio was buzzing with the story. Newspapers printed headlines in bold letters. CEO returns from the dead. Woman saved at own funeral. Homeless man becomes hero. Television crews swarmed the hospital where Judith was recovering, and crowds gathered outside, eager for updates. People spoke her name in grocery stores, in office hallways, in schools and churches. Judith Miller had become more than a businesswoman. She was a living miracle, a symbol of hope and survival. And Benjamin Carter, once invisible, was now at the center of it all. Inside the hospital, Judith's condition slowly stabilized. The drug that had silenced her body was wearing off, and her strength, though weak, began to return. She was confused, frightened, and deeply shaken by the knowledge that she had been seconds away from being buried alive. But she was also fiercely determined to know the truth. She wanted answers, and she would not rest until she had them. Margaret stayed by her side, holding her hand through every moment. Benjamin, though reluctant at first, was eventually persuaded to visit. When Judith saw him, her eyes filled with tears. Her voice was still faint, but she managed to whisper, "Thank you." For Benjamin, those two words were heavier than gold. No one had thanked him in years. No one had seen him, truly seen him, in what felt like a lifetime. In that moment, the broken pieces of his heart began to mend. But outside the hospital walls, storms were brewing. Investigators began to question how Judith had been declared dead when she was very much alive. Fingers pointed at Dr. Harris, whose medical credibility was now in tatters. Under pressure, he stammered excuses about rare conditions and misread signs, but few believed him. The authorities dug deeper, and soon whispers of foul play began to spread. Could it be that Judith's death had been more than a mistake? Could it have been planned? And if so, who stood to gain the most from her death? The answer loomed over everyone like a shadow. Her husband, Richard Miller. Richard, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Friends who once stood by him avoided his calls. Business associates whispered behind his back. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw Judith's face. Alive, breathing, staring at him from the coffin where she should have been silenced forever. His plan had not just failed, it had collapsed spectacularly, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He needed to find a way to regain control, but time was slipping away, and the truth was tightening around him like a noose. Judith's recovery continued, and with each passing day, her memory grew clearer. She remembered the moments before the darkness, the strange taste in her drink, the dizziness, the sudden collapse. She remembered Richard's face hovering above her as her body grew heavy, his cold eyes watching as life drained from her. And she remembered the doctor's voice, low and clinical, sealing her fate with a false declaration. Rage boiled in her chest as the pieces fell into place. The people she had trusted most had tried to destroy her, but they had failed. And now, Judith Miller was ready to fight back. The days that followed Judith's miraculous return were a whirlwind of tension and revelation. The hospital where she lay recovering became the center of a storm. Outside its walls, reporters camped out day and night, their cameras flashing at anyone who entered or left. Inside, doctors and nurses moved cautiously, aware that every action might be scrutinized by a nation suddenly obsessed with the woman who had risen from the grave. Judith, though weak, was clear in her determination. She wanted justice. She wanted the truth dragged out into the open, no matter how painful it might be. Her sister Margaret supported her, never leaving her side, but there was another constant presence too: Benjamin Carter. At first, he had hesitated to return after the chaos of the funeral. He was used to being pushed aside, told he didn't belong. But Judith herself had asked for him. She wanted him near, not as a bodyguard, not as an advisor, but as the man who had seen her life when everyone else saw only death. Benjamin was uncomfortable with the attention. The world suddenly wanted to know who he was. Newspapers ran stories about the homeless hero. Television hosts asked about his past, and strangers on the street stopped him to shake his hand. But Benjamin carried his shame like a weight on his back. To the public, he was a miracle worker. To himself, he was just a broken man who had once been something more. The law, however, was not interested in miracles. It was interested in crimes. And soon enough, the authorities arrived at the hospital to speak with Judith. With a calm but steady voice, she told them everything she remembered. The odd taste of her drink, the dizziness, the way her body had shut down, and the cold detachment in her husband's eyes as she collapsed. She described Dr. Harris, standing at her bedside, pronouncing her gone without hesitation. And she told them about the fear that had clung to her as she drifted in that gray space between life and death, certain she was being betrayed by the people closest to her. The investigators listened carefully. They had already discovered troubling details. Richard Miller had recently taken out massive insurance policies on Judith's life. He had moved large sums of money into private accounts. Dr. Harris's signature on the death certificate was rushed, his report missing details that any competent physician would have included. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and it was not a picture of accident or mistake. It was one of conspiracy. When Richard was brought in for questioning, he played the part of the grieving husband once more. He insisted that Judith had been sick, that her death had come suddenly, and that any strange financial moves were simply part of business. But his performance cracked under pressure. The investigators pressed him, pointing out the inconsistencies, the suspicious timing, the lack of true grief. His answers grew sharp, defensive, even angry. And the more he spoke, the more it became clear that he was not a man mourning a wife. He was a man cornered. Dr. Harris fared no better. His reputation, once solid, was crumbling under public scrutiny. He stammered about rare conditions, about how sometimes the body mimics death, about mistakes that any doctor might make. But when asked why he had been so quick to sign the certificate without further tests, his answers grew evasive. Pressure mounted, and soon the cracks in his story became gaping holes. He was hiding something and everyone knew it. It wasn't long before the case went to trial. The courthouse in Columbus became the stage for one of the most watched legal battles in Ohio's history. Crowds gathered on the courthouse steps each morning, reporters filled the hallways, and cameras broadcast every moment to a nation glued to their screens. The story had all the elements of a modern tragedy: wealth, betrayal, survival, and a man once dismissed as worthless rising as the unexpected hero. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Judith sat in the front row, still pale but stronger now, her presence commanding respect. Margaret sat beside her, a steady hand of comfort. And Benjamin, though reluctant, was called to testify. His worn clothes had been replaced by a simple suit donated by a local charity, but his eyes were still the same, tired, watchful, yet filled with quiet strength. When Benjamin took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke softly at first, describing how he had wandered into the cemetery that day, how he had seen Judith in the casket and felt something was wrong. He told them about the faint pulse, the shallow breaths, and the years of odd knowledge he carried from a life most people didn't know he'd lived. He explained how he had once studied medicine, how he had once been an engineer with a promising career, before a spiral of loss and bad choices had dragged him to the streets. His voice shook as he admitted his failures, his descent into poverty, the shame of being invisible. But that day, he said, his eyes fixed on Judith, something inside me refused to look away. Everyone else saw a body. I saw a life still fighting. And I couldn't let her be buried alive. His words struck the courtroom like a hammer. People wiped tears from their eyes. Even the judge paused, letting the silence stretch, as if to honor the weight of what had been said. Then came Richard's turn. He was defiant, his jaw set, his voice sharp. He denied everything, claimed Benjamin was lying, claimed Judith was confused, claimed the whole thing was a twisted mistake. But under cross-examination, his mask slipped. The prosecutor pressed him about the insurance policies, the money transfers, the coldness in his actions. Finally, Richard snapped. His voice rose, filled with bitterness that had long been festering. "She had everything," he shouted, his face red with rage. "The company, the money, the respect. And what did I have? I was just her shadow. Her husband in name, nothing more. You think it's easy living like that? Watching her tower over me every day while I was nothing. I deserved more. I deserved what she wouldn't give me." The courtroom gasped. His confession, raw and unplanned, hung in the air like a noose tightening around his neck. His attorney tried to calm him, but the damage was done. The truth was out. Richard Miller had been consumed by greed and envy, and in that dark pit, he had conspired to bury his wife alive. Dr. Harris was next, and under the crushing weight of evidence, he broke. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted his part in the plan. He had been promised money, power, security, things he had craved but never fully had. He confessed that he had administered the drug that slowed Judith's body, that he had lied on the certificate, that he had played God for the sake of greed. His words were a mixture of sorrow and cowardice, an attempt at redemption that came too late. The jury didn't take long. Richard Miller and Dr. Harris were both found guilty of attempted murder and conspiracy. Their sentences were life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with cheers outside the courthouse, the crowd erupting in celebration that justice had been served. But inside, the moment was quieter. Judith sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, as though releasing a burden she had carried for far too long. Margaret wrapped an arm around her, whispering that it was over, that she was safe now. Benjamin stood off to the side, his hands shoved into his pockets, unsure of where he belonged in this story anymore. For Judith, survival had given her more than a second chance. It had given her clarity. She had seen the darkest parts of human nature in the faces of her husband and her doctor, but she had also seen the brightest light in the eyes of a man the world had cast aside. And for Benjamin, the trial was not just about Judith's justice. It was about his own redemption. 4 years he had been invisible, forgotten, a ghost wandering the streets of Ohio. But in that courtroom the world had seen him. They had heard his voice, his truth, his pain, and his courage. And for the first time in a very long time he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he still had a place in the world. The trial was over, but the story was far from finished. Judith still had a company to rebuild, a life to reclaim. Benjamin still had demons to face, and choices to make about what kind of man he wanted to be. But for now, they both walked out of that courthouse into the crisp Ohio air, side by side, survivors of a nightmare that had nearly swallowed them whole. And the world, watching closely, waited to see what would come next. When the gavel struck and the trial ended, Judith Miller's life should have returned to something like normal. But normal was gone. Normal had been buried with the old coffin, with the old trust, with the old illusions she once held about love and loyalty. What came after was something different, something raw and fragile, something she would have to rebuild from the ground up. The first days after the verdict were the hardest. Reporters followed her every step, photographers camped outside her home, and strangers approached her on the street to shake her hand as though she were a celebrity. She smiled politely, thanked them for their kind words, but inside she longed for quiet. She wanted to walk through a grocery store without whispers behind her. She wanted to sit on her porch without a camera flashing across the street. More than anything, she wanted to breathe without feeling the weight of the past on her chest. Margaret became her anchor. Her sister had always been the steady one, the practical one, and now she filled Judith's days with small acts of comfort. Hot tea in the mornings, flowers by the window, a reassuring hand on her shoulder when the noise of the outside world became too much. There were nights when Judith woke screaming, the memory of cold earth pressing down on her chest, the echo of Richard's hateful eyes searing into her mind. And Margaret was always there, holding her until the terror faded, whispering that she was safe, that she was alive. Benjamin, too, was never far away. After the trial, he tried to disappear back into the shadows. He didn't want fame, didn't want people staring at him like he was some kind of saint. But Judith wouldn't let him fade. She called him, invited him to dinner, asked him to walk with her when she felt restless. First, he resisted. He told her he didn't belong in her world, that people like him didn't sit at polished tables or stroll through manicured gardens. But Judith simply smiled at him, that calm and steady smile, and said, "Benjamin, you saved me. You belong wherever you choose to stand." Slowly, he began to believe her. The town itself seemed to believe in him too. Donations poured in from strangers across Ohio. Money to help him find a home, to buy clothes, to start fresh. Local churches reached out with support, and community groups invited him to speak. First, Benjamin declined everything. He wasn't used to kindness, and he wasn't sure he deserved it. But Judith urged him to accept, not as charity but as recognition. "You gave me my second chance," she told him. "Let them give you yours." So Benjamin took a small apartment on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a clean room with a bed and a window that caught the morning light. He found work through a friend of Margaret's, helping with construction projects. His hands finding purpose again in the rhythm of building instead of wandering. And though he still carried the scars of the streets, he began to walk with his head a little higher, his shoulders a little straighter. Meanwhile, Judith faced her own mountain to climb. Her company, once thriving, had nearly collapsed under Richard's mismanagement and scandal. The board was fractured, investors were nervous, employees uncertain. Walking into that office for the first time after everything felt like stepping into a battlefield. But Judith, though shaken, was not weak. She stood before her people, her voice steady, her presence commanding, and she told them the truth. She told them she had been betrayed, but she had not been broken. She promised them transparency, fairness, and above all, resilience. It was not easy. Long hours stretched into longer nights, meetings dragged on with endless debates, and doubts crept in like shadows at every turn. But slowly, brick by brick, Judith rebuilt what had been torn apart. Some employees left, unable to face the scandal, but those who stayed believed in her with a loyalty deeper than before. They had watched her walk through death itself and return with fire in her eyes. They trusted her. Still, Judith knew that healing was not only about business. It was about the heart. And though she tried to focus on work, she found her thoughts drifting again and again to Benjamin. At first, she didn't understand it. They were from different worlds, shaped by different paths. She was the polished widow of a wealthy man, scarred but strong, rebuilding her empire. He was a man who had lived on the streets, who carried shame like a second skin. And yet, whenever they were together, she felt a peace she had never known. He didn't look at her as a businesswoman or a symbol or a survivor. He looked at her as Judith, just Judith. And in his eyes, she found something she hadn't found in Richard's in years: sincerity. One evening, as autumn painted Ohio in shades of gold and fire, Judith invited Benjamin to her home for dinner. Margaret was away visiting family, the house quiet and still. They ate simply: roast chicken, bread, a bottle of red wine Margaret had saved for a special occasion. And when the plates were cleared and the fire crackled in the hearth, Judith looked across at Benjamin and said softly, "Do you ever wonder why you were there that day? Why you walked into that cemetery at that exact moment?" Benjamin hesitated, his eyes on the flames. "All the time," he admitted. "Sometimes I think it was luck. Sometimes I think it was God. And sometimes I think, maybe I was meant to find you. Because saving you gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost." Judith felt tears sting her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of something unspoken blossoming between them. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it on his. He didn't pull away. It was not a love story in the traditional sense, not yet. It was something deeper, slower, built on shared scars and mutual respect. Judith knew her heart was still fragile, and Benjamin knew his own wounds were far from healed. But as the weeks turned into months, they leaned on each other. They laughed together, they cried together, and in the quiet moments, they simply sat in silence, letting the presence of the other be enough. The people of Ohio watched this unlikely bond with fascination. Some whispered that it was improper, that Judith should not be seen with a man of Benjamin's background. Others cheered her on, calling it a story of hope, of love rising from ashes. Judith paid no mind to the whispers. She had faced death, betrayal, and humiliation. She had no patience left for gossip. Her focus was on the life she was rebuilding, and the man who had walked with her through the darkest valley. By winter, Judith's company was back on its feet, stronger than before. Benjamin had found steady work and was beginning to save money. His life no longer a series of empty days. Margaret, ever watchful, teased Judith about her friendship with Benjamin but secretly admired the way her sister glowed in his presence. But healing is never a straight road. There were setbacks. Judith still battled nightmares. Benjamin still wrestled with guilt and self-doubt. Some nights he would leave her porch abruptly, muttering that he didn't deserve her kindness, that he was still the man who had thrown his life away. And Judith, instead of chasing him, would wait patiently until he returned, because she knew that healing couldn't be forced. It had to be chosen over and over again. And that was what made their bond so powerful. It was not built on perfection but on persistence. By the time the first snow fell, Judith stood at her window one evening, watching the flakes drift down like blessings. Benjamin sat beside her, a cup of coffee in his hands, his gaze quiet but steady. And in that silence, Judith realized something profound. She was alive not just in body but in spirit. And she was not alone. Her story had nearly ended in darkness, but now it was unfolding in light. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew this. Whatever came next, she and Benjamin would face it together. The passing of time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. Seasons changed in Ohio, each one leaving its quiet mark on Judith Miller's life. The trial, the chaos, the sleepless nights. Those things did not vanish, but they became part of her story rather than her present. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had chosen after. To live, to fight, to forgive. The first year after Richard and Dr. Harris were sentenced was the hardest. Judith still walked through her home and sometimes half expected to see Richard sitting in his chair, his glass of bourbon on the table. But instead of bitterness rising in her chest, there was a strange kind of emptiness. The man who had betrayed her so cruelly was gone, locked away in a prison cell. She could spend the rest of her days hating him, or she could release him from her heart. And slowly, carefully, she chose release. It was not forgiveness in the way people imagine, No sudden burst of compassion, no grand gesture. It was quieter than that. It was waking up in the morning and deciding not to let his face fill her mind. It was walking past his old belongings and choosing not to cry. It was telling herself again and again, "He no longer has power over me." Margaret noticed the change first. One spring morning as they planted flowers in the garden, she said gently, "You're smiling more these days. It's good to see, Judith. You're finding your peace." Judith paused, wiping dirt from her hands, and looked at the bright blooms before her. "I think I'm finally remembering who I was before all this. And maybe discovering who I want to be now." Benjamin, too, was finding his footing. He still carried his past like a shadow, but it no longer swallowed him whole. The small apartment he once treated as temporary began to feel like home. The steady job on construction sites gave him dignity, and he found himself making friends among the crew, men who respected him not as a curiosity but as a worker who showed up every day and gave his best. And yet, his connection to Judith remained the center of his new life. They didn't label it, not at first. There was no rush into romance, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there were evenings spent on her porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer dark. There were afternoons when she invited him into her office to ask his opinion, not because she needed it but because she valued his honesty. There were winter nights when he would bring wood for her fireplace and stay to talk until the fire burned low. Slowly, what had been friendship blossomed into something deeper. The world around them took notice. Newspapers had long since moved on to other stories, but locally people still whispered. Some judged Judith for being close to a man who had lived on the streets, who carried scars of failure. Others admired her all the more, saying she had chosen a path of truth instead of appearances. Judith didn't care either way. She had walked through death and returned. What were whispers compared to that? Benjamin, however, wrestled with doubt. There were nights when he would sit across from Judith, listening to her speak with such grace, watching her move with such strength, and he would think, she deserves someone better, someone whole. One evening he gave voice to that fear. They were sitting by the fire, the room filled with the scent of pine. "Judith," he said quietly, "I don't know what you see in me. I'm not a man with wealth or reputation. My past is a mess. I don't know if I'm enough for you." Judith turned to him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "Benjamin," she said, "do you know what I saw when everyone else saw nothing? You're the man who listened when no one else cared, who acted when everyone else froze. You didn't save me because of wealth or reputation. You saved me because that's who you are. And that's enough. More than enough." Benjamin lowered his gaze, his throat tight, but inside something shifted. He began to believe her. As the years unfolded, their lives intertwined more and more. Benjamin continued working, eventually taking on leadership roles in projects that rebuilt parts of the town. Judith, with Margaret's help, transformed her company into something new. Not just a business, but a force for good. She launched programs to provide opportunities for the homeless, the struggling, the forgotten. And at the heart of it was Benjamin's story. She never spoke of him as a project or a symbol. She spoke of him as a man, her friend, and eventually her partner. Together, they became a quiet testament to resilience. But the true turning point came one summer day, years after the trial. Judith and Benjamin traveled to a small cemetery outside town. The same place where it had all begun. The air was warm, the grass tall and swaying. They walked together in silence, until they stood before a simple patch of earth. There was no coffin beneath it. Judith's body had never rested there, but the memory of that day lingered in the soil, in the stones, in the wind that whispered through the trees. Judith knelt, her hand brushing the grass. "This was supposed to be the end," she said softly. But instead, it was the beginning. Benjamin stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze distant. "I still don't know why I came here that day," he admitted. "But I'm glad I did." Judith looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "Maybe it doesn't matter why. Maybe it just matters that you did. Because from that moment, everything changed." He offered her his hand, and she took it, rising to her feet. Together they stood in the place of death, but what radiated between them was life. From that day on, they stopped questioning the bond they shared. They stopped worrying about labels, about what others might think. They simply lived side by side in trust and in quiet love. Years passed. Margaret eventually married a kind man she had met through Judith's company and built a life filled with joy. Judith's business thrived, not just in profits but in purpose, known across Ohio as a beacon of integrity. Benjamin, though he never sought fame, became a respected voice in the community, often asked to speak about second chances and redemption. And through it all, Judith and Benjamin grew older together, their lives a tapestry woven from pain and healing, from loss and love. They faced struggles, as all couples do. Illness, disagreements, the weight of the past, but they faced them as they had always done, together. On quiet evenings, long after the cameras had vanished and the world had moved on, Judith would sit with Benjamin on the porch of their shared home. The air would be cool, the stars scattered across the Ohio sky. She would lean against him, and he would rest his arm around her, and in the silence, they would both know that their story, though born in betrayal and near tragedy, had become something beautiful. And if a passerby happened to glance at them in that stillness, they would see not a wealthy widow and a former homeless man, but two souls who had found each other in the darkest of places and chosen, day after day, to walk in the light. For in the end, Judith's life was not defined by Richard's betrayal, nor by Dr. Harris's greed, nor even by the trial that had captured the world's attention. It was defined by survival, by forgiveness, and by the quiet, steady love that grew from it all. And Benjamin's life was not defined by his failures, nor by the streets he once wandered. It was defined by the moment he refused to look away, the moment he chose to see life where others saw death. It was defined by the second chance he gave her, and the second chance she gave him. Together, their story was not one of tragedy, but of redemption. A story that began in a graveyard and ended on a porch under the stars, with hearts that had finally found home. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of ending. Not dramatic, not perfect, but deeply, quietly satisfying. The kind that lingers in the heart long after the words are finished.